the Linux rescue and recovery process. In this nugget, we're going to talk about the Linux rescue process. We'll learn how to boot into the Linux rescue process. We'll talk about what commands are available to us, how the file systems are arranged, that sort of stuff. And then we'll actually go through and break something and fix it, and you'll get a sense of how the Linux rescue process works. All right, well, let's get down to it. All right, well, let's talk about the Linux rescue process in some general terms here to give you an idea of what has to go on to get into the rescue mode and what you're going to do once you're in there. Then we'll move out to the Linux screen and actually follow through and do some of this stuff. So the first thing is you need some sort of a boot disk, either a floppy boot disk or the CDs that your distribution came on to boot into rescue mode. The floppy boot disk you can create during an installation. That's one thing. Another thing that you can do is that you can actually create it after you've already installed Linux, and I'll show you how to do that in this nugget. Then once you boot up off of the rescue disk or off one of these boot floppy or boot CDs, then what you can do is get into Linux rescue mode. And once you're in there, some useful commands that you should know are fscheck for file system check, fdisk, which we've already learned. Actually, we learned both of these back in I think it was the second nugget of this series. And the file system check has to do with checking and repairing file system. Fdisk deals with partition information, displaying partition information, altering partitions, things like that you can do with fdisk. E2 label has to do with seeing labels on or changing labels on a particular partition, and then sync has to do with writing out information that's in memory out to disk. So a lot of times what happens is when you're doing a write, like you're editing some file and you say save it, and then what happens is the processor or the computer hasn't really written it out to disk yet. It's just written it to a buffer in memory, and by using the sync command you can force that buffer in memory to be written out to disk so that your changes are actually saved to disk. Okay, so there's an overview of the Linux rescue process. Let's move out to the Linux screen and talk about first how to create a boot floppy after you've already installed Linux, and then we'll go through and actually look at the rescue mode in more detail. Well, the first thing I want to do here at the Linux screen is show you how to make a boot disk after you've already installed Linux. Okay, so like I told you before, when you're doing the installation, you have a choice to make a boot floppy disk, but perhaps you chose not to do that at the time, or you did it and now you've lost your boot floppy and now you need to make one. Okay, so before we do that, let me just make another note here, is that you can see the machine that I'm on for this nugget is called Nugget Rescue. This is a new machine. I'm not using the same machine that I was using for previous nuggets and that I'm going to use again for future nuggets, because some of the stuff I'm going to be doing in this nugget could cause data loss and stuff. I'm going to break some things, make it so I can't boot into my system and so on, and I just wanted to use a separate system so that I didn't mess anything up in some unfixable way. Okay, so if you're going to follow along and do some of the exercises that I'm going to do in this nugget, then I suggest either installing Linux on some old machine just to practice on, or if you only have one machine at your disposal and you feel like you want to practice some of this stuff, then make sure you have a complete backup of your system right before you undertake this. Okay, so that's our machine Nugget Rescue for this particular nugget, and what we're going to do first, like I said, is make a boot disk. Alright, so first I have to be the root user to do this, so I'm going to switch over to be the root user. And then the command is called make boot disk, okay, and it's in the /sbin directory. So I'm going to just hit enter here, and we'll see the options that you can use with make boot disk. You can look up the info page and see what all these various options are, and you can see the example down here at the bottom. Make boot disk -- device, then you specify the device that is your floppy disk drive, and then you give the version of the kernel that you want to make a boot disk for. Okay, so if you go and do a listing of /lib/modules, you'll see your kernel version number right there. Mine is 2.4.18-14. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a boot disk. I have to give the path sbin directory, make a boot disk, and then I say -- device. I give my floppy device number, which is FD0, and then I give the kernel version number, which is 2.4.18-14. Okay, so there we go. So now it's going to say, okay, put a disk in that drive. I'm going to reach over here and put the disk in the drive, and then it says press enter to continue or control C to abort, and then I press enter, and now the disk is being created, and it's going to be a boot disk that will boot me into this kernel version number 2.4.18. All right, well, now I want to walk you through a series of screenshots to show you how to get into the rescue mode with Red Hat Linux. All right, so what I've done now is I've shut down my system as it was running before. I stuck in the first disk of my distribution CDs, and I turned on my computer again, and now I'm at the first stage of an installation, basically. If I wanted to install Red Hat Linux in graphical mode, I'd hit enter. If I wanted to install it in text mode, I'd type Linux text. But what I'm going to do down here is type Linux rescue to get into rescue mode. So let me just forward you through this series of screenshots. Okay, so I type Linux rescue down here, I hit enter, and now the system is booting. Okay, this is like just one screenshot of the system booting up. Here's another screenshot of the system continuing to boot. Now it's loading a SCSI driver for my hard disk, because it's a SCSI hard disk. As I move forward, now we're at the stage where it looks like we're doing an installation. So I'm going to be picking a language and a keyboard type and so on, but then it's going to actually put me into rescue mode instead of doing an install. So okay, so I say, okay, I want an English as the language to do this. I have a US keyboard, and now you can see down here it says running Anaconda, the system installer, please wait, and now we're at this rescue screen. Okay, so let's take a look at what this says and talk about what our three options here mean. Alright, so it says the rescue environment will now attempt to find your Red Hat Linux installation and mount it under the directory /mount/sysimage. Okay, so everything that used to be at the top level of your file system before, like the slash directory, like the etc directory was a subdirectory, the user directory, the bin directory, the sbin directory, all those directories are now going to be under mount/sysimage as they used to be. Okay, so it's going to mount that whole file system that we had before under mount/sysimage. So if I just hit continue, then that old file system will be mounted under mount/sysimage, and I can read it, I can write to it, I can change things, and so on. Okay, if I choose read only here, then it will still mount my old file system under mount/sysimage, except that now I won't be able to make any changes to the old file system. I will only be able to read it if I choose read only. I can also choose skip, and that will skip this whole process altogether. It will not mount my old file system under mount/sysimage. It's just going to go into the minimal rescue mode. So continue here, if I hit continue, that's sort of going into what's called normal rescue mode, and if I hit skip, that's going into the minimal rescue mode. Okay, so I'm just going to hit continue for this example, and we can go in and then look around and sort of see what the rescue environment's like, what kind of tools we have available to us, commands we have available to us. Then later we'll break some stuff and we'll come back to this screen and we'll hit skip so that we can then go through and do everything sort of manually by hand, so you can get an idea of the what's involved if you don't have this auto mount your old file system under mount/sysimage. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to hit continue for now. And now it says your system has been mounted under mount/sysimage. So if I just press return here, I get a shell. And when I exit from the shell, the system's going to reboot automatically. Okay. Now there's a command called change root that they're talking about here. So if you would like to make your system the root environment, run the command change root mount/sysimage anytime you want once you're in the shell. And what change root does is it says make the new root of the file system, like the slash directory, make that equal to this directory here that I'm writing. So if I said change root mount/sysimage, then the root of my file system will be sort of the old root of my file system, and I can work from there if I wanted to do that. Okay, so I'm going to click OK here, and now we're at the bash shell. Okay, and you can see it's okay. The system's mounted under mount/sysimage. When it's finished, please exit from the shell, and your system will reboot automatically. Okay, now we're going to move out to the Linux screen to the shell window live again, so you can see me do some of the stuff, and we're going to poke around in the rescue environment and sort of see what's there. Alright, so here we are in the rescue environment. We click continue back at that last screen, so it told us that it was going to mount our old file system under /mount/sysimage. Okay, so let's just look around here a little bit. Let's see what our working directory is. We're in the top level directory, and if I do an ls here, you'll see a bunch of familiar subdirectories, /bin, /dev, /etsy, /live. However, these are not the same directories as those that were in my original file system. Okay, those directories, like we just said, were under /mount/sysimage. Okay, so under mount sysimage, there's bin, boot, dev, etsy, and so on. Those are the subdirectories from my original file system, my actual Linux file system. The ones up above from the actual /etsy directory, for instance, is in some sense like the rescue mode etsy directory. Okay, so if I do an ls of /etsy, that's the rescue mode etsy directory. It only has a handful of configuration files, just like the most necessary ones for rescue mode. Okay. Now, if you want to see, for instance, what commands you have available to you in rescue mode, well, you can do things like ls/users/bin or something. Okay. Let me pipe that through more. And these are commands that you have available to you in rescue mode. So you can do, you can see all these commands: copy and kill commands and mount commands and make directory commands and so on. Okay. So these are some commands that you have available to you in rescue mode. You can also look at user/sbin. Okay, there's a bunch more commands that you have available to you in rescue mode. And you can poke around and look in the various other directories like /sbin and /bin and so on to see other commands that you have available to you in rescue mode. Okay, so that's a quick little tour of what the rescue mode environment looks like. It's just a really basic shell. You've got the basic set of commands, and your old file system, remember, is under mount sysimage if you chose it to be that way when you went into rescue mode. Now what we're going to do is we're going to break a couple things, configuration files and so on, look at what happens, and then go into rescue mode and fix them. Okay, so you can sort of follow through the process of how you go about fixing things in rescue mode. Alright, so what I want to do now is actually break something so that when we go back into rescue mode, we'll have something to fix. So I want to break something that will cause my system not to boot up. One of the things that I can break that'll be easy is the grub configuration file. So grub, remember, is the bootloader, the Grand Unified Bootloader, and we're going to go in there and then alter some of the settings. So let me first become the super user so that I can alter these files. Let's go up to the /etsy directory and let's Emacs the grub.configuration file. Okay, so we're going to open up this configuration file in the editor, the Emacs editor. And you can see the configuration file here. Basically, what it's doing is the title here, Red Hat Linux. This title is anything. It's telling you what kernel version of Red Hat Linux we can boot. It says to boot off of the first hard drive. Hard drive 0 is the first hard drive. It tells you what the kernel number is and so on. Okay, so it also says here the default is 0, okay, so it would boot the first thing in this list, and the timeout is 10. So if I don't make a choice within 10 seconds, it's going to only pick the first thing. Okay, so there's only one thing in my list. Like if I had a dual boot system, there would be multiple entries in this list. But for now, like I said, I only have one system, so let's just mess up this description here, and instead of booting off the first hard drive, let's boot off the second hard drive, okay, which I don't have. So I don't have a second hard drive. So when I say here boot off of HD1, which is the second hard drive, some error is going to result, and I'm not going to be able to boot up my system. So let me hit Control-X, Control-C to save the file, say yes, and now if I cat out grub.conf, you'll see that I've got my HD1, 0. It says boot off the second hard drive, which I don't have, so that's going to cause a problem. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to shut my system down and try to reboot it, and we'll look at some of the screen captures of what happens when I try to reboot it, the error message that I get, and then I'm going to boot into rescue mode. We're going to look around, look at some of the tools we can use, and actually fix this. Okay, so now I'm going to boot up my system with the bad grub.configuration file, or at least I'm going to try to boot up my system with the bad grub.configuration file. So this is the normal screen. I'll hit enter. Again, I'm walking you through a series of screenshots of this, and I'll hit enter here, and now it says selected disk does not exist, press any key to continue. Okay, and you can see here it says root HD1, 0, selected disk does not exist. That's a little bit of a key as to what's going on. And this is completely staged, right? Like I have broken this on purpose, and I'm going to go back in and fix it, and I already know what I'm looking for even before I get into the rescue mode. Typically, in real life situations, you're not going to know exactly what's broken. Okay, but that being said, there's two things that are basically going to cause you to go into rescue mode. One is some sort of a hardware error, like your disk is corrupted, or your disk is degrading and it starts failing in certain places. And if one of those places that your disk starts failing is in, like the master boot record, the first 512 bytes or whatever of your disk, then your system's not going to boot up, and you're going to have to go in there and repair it with fdisk or something like that. Okay, the other reason that your system might not boot up is because of a configuration file change that you made that was an error, okay, that wasn't, you didn't do the right thing. And so anytime you make a change to a configuration file that is a critical configuration file, like grub.conf or like some file system table configuration file, something like that, anytime you make changes to those kinds of configuration files that affect the booting process, you should go back and test right away after you make those changes to make sure that the system still boots up. There's no other way to test those changes except to make sure that your system boots. So if you go ahead, your system boots up great, you make changes to say grub.conf and the file system table configuration file and so on, and then you don't reboot your system for like a month, and then in a month you come back and boot your system and it doesn't boot up. Well, why? What happened? Well, it could be a whole slew of things, and it would be nice if you could eliminate the configuration file changes as a possible problem. And the way that you can do that is after you make the changes to those kinds of configuration files, you immediately reboot the system to test to make sure that your changes were correct. Okay, so while this event right here is completely staged, it does fall into the realm of the kinds of things that happen that make your system not boot up. Okay, so I'm going to press any key to continue here, and then what I'm going to do is put in the distribution CDs again, and I'm back to like this first screen of when you boot off the CD. I'm going to type Linux Rescue down here, just like we did before. Now the system's booting up, and now it's loading my SCSI driver for my disk drive. I'm picking my language and my keyboard, and now it's saying it's running the system installer again, and now I'm back to that rescue screen. Well, this time, instead of choosing continue, I'm going to choose skip so that it does not mount my old file system under mount/sysimage. Okay, I'm just going to get in there bare bones and just have the stuff that, like in the minimal rescue mode. And then what we'll do is we'll mount those particular directories that we want to mount. We'll mount those by hand. Okay, and then we'll go through and do that. All right, so I'm going to select skip here, and now here we are at the bash shell in the minimal rescue mode, and it says, notice when you exit from the shell, your system will reboot automatically. Okay, so that's the rescue mode. Now we're back into rescue mode after our system didn't boot. Now let's go back out to the shell screen again and fix the problem that we created, and learn some other stuff about some of the commands that are available to us in rescue mode. Alright, so now here we are in the minimal rescue mode. Let's just look at some of the difference between this rescue mode and the normal rescue mode that we were just in a few minutes ago. If I do an ls at the top level directory, you'll see the exact same subdirectories that we saw in normal rescue mode. What you won't see, though, is in the mount directory, you won't see the /sysimage subdirectory because we didn't choose to mount our file system under /mount/sysimage. Okay, so that's one thing. That's like the major difference between minimal rescue mode and normal rescue mode. Now, why would you not want to have the system automatically mount your old file system under mount sysimage? Well, one of the reasons why you might choose to do that is because the files, if you're going to do a file system check on a file system, it can't be mounted. So if you suspect that one of the file systems or one of the partitions of your old file system is corrupt and you want to do a file system check on that, then it can't be mounted. So this is the way you would proceed. You would choose skip at the last screen when you were saying whether you want to mount the old file systems or not. You'd get into minimal rescue mode, and then you can do the file system check on those particular partitions that you want to check. Okay, so let's look at use the fdisk-l command. We talked about fdisk back, I think it was in the second nugget of this series, and this is going to list all of the partitions that are on our normal file system. So you can see there's SDA1, SDA2, and SDA3. What we can do here, we can run a file system check on a particular partition. E2FS check is a variant of file system check for extended to file systems, which these file systems are of that type. So I'm going to run E2FS check on /dev/SDA1 and see what comes up here. And you can see what it says. It says clean, 42 out of this many files, this many out of this many blocks, and so on. Okay, so the file system check proceeded, and the only reason I could do that file system check is because the file system itself was not mounted yet. Okay, another command that I talked about before was the E2label command. So using E2label, we can look at /dev/SDA1 and determine what mount point that partition has. So there we do that, and we can see that partition, SDA1, has a mount point of /boot. And we can do the same thing for /dev/SDA2. Okay, and we can see that that partition has a mount point of /. Okay, so in our normal file systems, SDA2 is the / directory, SDA1 refers to the /boot directory. Okay, so what I want to do now is from this top level directory, I want to make a directory called temp mount. Okay, this directory called temp mount is going to hold the file systems and the partitions that I choose to mount. I'm going to mount them manually. So I'm going to make this directory, do a listing, and you can see now that temp mount is one of the subdirectories of my top level directory. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount /dev/SDA2, the / directory, to /temp mount. Okay, there. Now temp mount has that stuff. So if I do an ls of temp mount, you'll see the top level directory of my old file system. Okay, everything's in there. If I go into /tempmount/etc, that's my old etc directory. Okay, it's the same thing as mount sysimage etc that we saw in normal rescue mode, right? Because that's exactly what got mounted under /mount/sysimage is my old file system, and that's the same etc that you're seeing here under temp mount. Now, if I go into the boot directory though, and I look in there, oops, I'm sorry, I'm not in the right directory here. Let me ls/tempmount/boot. Okay, look at the files in the boot directory, and there aren't any. How come? Because the boot directory, if you look at the top of this screen here, the boot directory was partition SDA1, and I have not mounted partition SDA1 yet. But I can do that, right? I can mount that. Let me go back to the top level directory. I'm going to say mount /dev/SDA1 and put that in tempmount/boot. Okay, now if I do an ls of tempmount/boot, we'll see my old boot directory, my original file system's boot directory. And now I've mounted both SDA1 and SDA2. They're both under this directory temp mount. And now I can proceed and do whatever I want in terms of fixing stuff. Okay, so the basic thing that I got here was I got into this mode. I can do fscheck, fdisk, I can use the E2label command, I can do a make directory, I can mount particular partitions and file systems on the directories that I've created. Okay, and now I've set up the system so that now I can go ahead and do the fix that I want to do. Alright, well now let's go ahead and actually make the changes to the grub.conf configuration file, then we'll reboot our system and see that everything's fine. Okay, so I'm going to use the VI editor, and I'm going to edit the tempmount etc grub.conf configuration file. Okay. Now remember, this is all staged. I broke the grub.conf configuration file on purpose so that I could show you some stuff about rescue mode. Okay. What you would be doing right now in reality is, deducing what the problem is, what changes you need to make, that sort of thing. And the only way to really get good at this sort of stuff is to practice. Okay. And if you haven't had enough experience using this sort of thing, well, you can read case examples on the internet of how people changed their system or why their system didn't boot up, the solutions they went through to make their system boot up properly. Okay. Now that being said, a lot of the problems that result in this sort of situation, the reason systems don't boot, is because of user error. Okay, like you made some change to a critical configuration file like grub.conf or the file system table configuration file, and then your system doesn't boot up anymore. Well, that's your fault. The moral of the story here is don't let the problems linger. If you make a change to grub.conf or some other file that affects the boot process, go ahead, after you make that change, go ahead and reboot the system right then. Okay? If you immediately reboot the system and it doesn't boot up, then you know exactly what configuration file it was that is the cause of the problem because you just changed it. Okay? Whereas if you make a change to grub.conf today and the file system table configuration file tomorrow and some other file, some other critical configuration file in a few days, and then next week you go to reboot your system and it doesn't boot up, well, you don't know exactly which configuration file it was that caused this problem. Okay? So if you're ever making changes to these critical files, reboot the system, don't let the problems linger and end up causing yourself more work, because then you have to deduce exactly which change it was or which combination of changes it was that caused this thing to not boot up. Okay, so now let's actually go and make this change. So I'm going to use VI to edit this file because VI is the only editor that I have available to me in rescue mode. Okay, if you're not really familiar with the VI editor, like for me, for example, I use Emacs all the time. So VI is not really commonplace to me, but I keep enough commands, VI commands, fresh in my mind so that I can do the basic stuff in VI, like use VI in rescue mode. If you don't ever use VI, at least have a cheat sheet or a book around or something to keep, so that you have the commands available to you, so that when you go into rescue mode, you can actually do something with the VI editor. Alright, so I'm going to hit enter here, and now I'm in the grub.conf configuration file. I'm going to hit the down arrow to go down here. I'm going to hit X to delete that 1. Then I'm going to hit I for insert mode, type 0 to insert that 0. Okay. Then I'm going to hit escape, and then shift colon and WQ to write my changes and quit. Okay, so that's the only change I want to make to the grub.conf configuration file. I'm going to do that, and now the system, it's done. Okay, what has actually happened now, though, is that this change to grub.conf has actually been written to memory, or RAM. It hasn't necessarily been written to disk yet. Okay, and the way that I can force that to be written to disk is by using the sync command. Alright, sync will force that change, or force that write that's been written out to a buffer in memory to actually be written to the disk. Okay, now you'll see some people suggest that you should run the sync command 3 times just to make sure that that change has been written out to disk. I've never had a problem with just running it once, but I'm going to follow the suggestion and run it 3 times just to make sure that that change has been written from the buffers in memory out to the actual disk. Okay, now what I need to do is unmount the 2 file systems that I mounted. So I'm going to go to the top level directory. I'm going to say unmount temp mount / boot. Okay, and then I'm going to say unmount / temp mount. And now what I can do is pull out my the CDs that I used to get into rescue mode. Okay, let me pull those out of the system. And then I'm going to reboot the computer. Okay, and then and remember, all I have to do to reboot the computer is just type exit. Okay, and then when I type exit, then the system's going to reboot, and I'm going to go into, hopefully my system's going to boot up properly then. Okay, so I'm just going to hit exit, and I'll see you back at the login screen. Alright, and now we're back to the login screen for the Nugget Rescue computer, and I rebooted the system, and my change took effect, and now I'm back to a normal functioning system that wasn't functioning when I altered the grub.conf configuration file. Alright, so let's just wrap up this Nugget now. Let's go back to the whiteboard and wrap this up. All right, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on the Linux rescue and recovery process. We started by talking about just how to get into the rescue mode using either a boot floppy or the distribution CDs. Okay, and I also showed you first how to make the boot floppy if you chose not to do it during the installation process. And then we talked about the 3 variations of rescue mode. The basic rescue mode was that it would mount your old file system under mount/sysimage as a read-write file system, so you could go in there and make changes. The other option was that you could mount your old file system under mount/sysimage, but mount it as a read-only file system, so you could just look and see what's wrong, but you couldn't make any changes. And the final variation was you didn't mount your old file system at all. And the reason you might want to do that is so that you can do a file system check on the various partitions of that file system. And I showed you some of the ways that you can do that. Then we talked about the available commands in Linux rescue mode. We walked through an example of actually fixing a configuration file and then writing our changes and rebooting the system, and we saw how that worked. One of the commands that you shouldn't forget is that sync command, because sometimes you can make the changes, you can identify the change and make it, but it doesn't get written out to disk because you didn't force the buffer, the memory buffer, to be written out to disk before you rebooted. So keep that sync command in mind, and remember, a lot of people suggest that you do sync 3 times to make sure that you flush those buffers and write them to disk. All right, well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.